Today's daf is daf Yud Beis. Now you may remember that on daf Yud Aleph Amid Beis, we had a case where you have a city, and in the outskirts of the city there's a marketplace. In the city itself, the day is a day of a festival for that deity. So obviously you don't want to go into that city. But can you do business in the marketplace outside the city? And the Gemara asks, Hechi dami chutzala, that what is considered outside the city, such that you're permitted to do business in that marketplace, despite the fact that in the city, which is contiguous to this marketplace, they are worshiping their idols and celebrating their festival. And the Gemara wants to know, how far is it from the city itself where they are celebrating Avoda Zara and this marketplace where you're permitted to do business? Rab Shim ben Lakish. So we're now on Daf Yud Aleph Amud Beis, in the last two lines on the Amud. Kegon Atloza Shel Aza. If you take a look, says Reish Lakish, at the city of Aza, where they have this permanent idol worshipping sanctuary, and you'll see that outside the city of Aza, mamash right outside the city, there's an atloza, which is a marketplace. And even though, says Reish Lakish, the marketplace is that close to the city in which they're worshiping Avodah Zarah, nevertheless, you're allowed to do business in the marketplace. Ika Diamri. Now, again, we have here a masu matan between Reb Shimon ben Lakish and Rabbi Chanina. The second transmission of this dialogue by Minei Reb Shimon ben Lakish me Reb Chanina. It wasn't that Reish Lakish was answering the question of how far is the marketplace away from the city such that we could permit doing business in the marketplace, but rather it was Reish Lakish who raised the question to Reb Chanina, and he asked him, Atloza shel Azamau, am I allowed to do business in the marketplace that's directly outside the city of Aza, where they're worshiping on this day their festival? Amalei, and Rabbi Chanina responded, Lo halachto litzur miyamecha? Did you, this is a rhetorical question, did you never go to Tzur in your life? And what would you have seen in Tzur, where the Jews and the idol worshippers live in somewhat close proximity? V'ra'isa Yisrael v'yovid kol chavim, and now we're going to start our daf for today, daf Yud Beis, sheshafsu shteik deros agabi kira achas. So a kira is a small stove, and it has two fires on it, and a kidera is a pot that's on the fire and is cooking. The akum, who worships his idols, is cooking his pot, and you're cooking on your pot right next door to each other, two pots on one stove. And the Chachamim, lo chashuv Chacham, the Chacham said nothing about it. They, by acquiescing through silence, apparently they tacitly agreed that this is okay. So therefore, why do you, Reish Lakish, ask this question to me, Rabbi Chanina, about whether or not you're allowed to do business outside of the city of Aza in the marketplace that's really next door? It's no different than the case in Tzur, where the Chacham didn't make any big deal about permitting a Jew and a Goy, the Goy is an Ovid Avodah Zara, to have their pots simultaneously cooking on the same stove. So the Gemara says, Milo Chashalev Chacham, what would have been the possible chashash here that would have concerned the Rabbanim according to Rabbi Chanina in the case of Tzur, of two pots on the same stove? And now we're going to have three answers to this question. The first is Abai, Mishum Bosa Nevela. It's very possible that the idolater who has non-kosher food in his pot might place some of his food into the pot of the Israel. And you're left with an avelo, which is, again, is non-kosher meat, that's now being cooked in the pot of the Israel. And therefore, the Chiddush of Reb Chanina, based on the case in Tzur, where Lo Choshev Chachamim, is that Dilma Lo Amoron Dilma Mahader Ape Yisrael Achore V'Shadi Ovikochavim Nevela B'Kdei Rasa. We don't have to be worried that a moment that the Jew turns his back, the idolater will put nevela into his pot. We're not afraid of such a thing.
You know what? I've heard a question about people sitting on airplanes and when their kosher meal was served, being concerned when they walked to the bathroom
Ah,
coming back that their neighbor did something. So
so
that's
that's what,
something we wouldn't have to worry about.
right. That's what Abai is pointing out. We don't have to worry about that. That's an excellent contemporary case. And Rava says he doesn't even think there was a Havamina. We'll soon see Rava that such a thing should be prohibited. Now, if this is the Chiddush of Rab Chanina based on the story in Tzur, what was the analogy, according to Abaye, that Rab Chanina made between the case of Tzur and the question of entering into business transactions in the marketplace outside of Aza? Says the statement of Abaye, the Kavasa Hochanami, you might have thought here too, Lo Choshelem Chachamim Mishum Dmei Avodas Kochavim. Maybe there's a possibility that if the Jew in the marketplace outside Aza will sell whatever he's selling in the marketplace and he's receiving funds from the people in the marketplace, those are the people who came out of the next door city of Aza. And perhaps the monies that they are using, these Azatians, right, these Gazans, to pay the Jew for whatever he's selling them in the marketplace is money that they received for Avoda Zara. In other words, the Torah says, Lo yidbak biyodcha me'umim and acherem, that we're not allowed to have any benefit from Avoda Zara, even from monies that may have been collected for the purpose of Avoda Zara. For example, what they had was that the priests of the idolatry would collect taxes to keep their own system running and also to pay for the whatever the idols needed. So all those monies have the status of Avodah Zarah with an Isur Hanam. Maybe we should be afraid that some of the monies that were used for Avodah Zarah purposes in the city of Aza next door are now being paid to the Jews in the marketplace. And that's what Reb Chanina wanted to achieve through this analogy to the case of Tzur with the two pots, that just like in that case, we're not afraid that the guy will take his nevela and put it into the pot of the Jew next door meaning on the same stove. So too, we're not afraid that the monies that came out of the city of Aza being brought by these citizens of Aza into the marketplace contiguous to Aza are being paid to the Yisrael in order to pay him for the whatever he's selling them. But Rava says, Milo choshelem chachamim. What's going on over here? There's no concern whatsoever that the guy is going to put nevela into the pot of the Jew immediately when the Jew turns his back around. I don't need Rabbi Hanina to point that out. But rather, what is the chash? And what was the analogy that Rabbi Hanina wanted to make between the case in Tzur with the two pots on the stove and our Mishnah in doing business outside the city? Mishum bishulei alvoli kochavim. We're going to see a sugi at the end of Masechta Avodah Zarah that the Rabbanan made a takana that if the guy turns on the fire under the food, even if the food is kosher food, the food becomes prohibited under Bishul Akum because it was cooked by the idolater. And therefore, in the case where you have two pots on the same stove, you might think that at some point, maybe the idolater would turn on the fire underneath the pot of the Yisrael. For example, let's say the Yisrael is busy or the fire went out and it has to be relit, so they're good neighbors and a good neighbor policy, and the guy is going to now turn on the fire underneath the food of the pot of the Israel. Here too, we have something similar in the case of a marketplace outside of Aza. Maybe the Chachamim should be afraid that here too there's a day called Yom Edom, which is the day in which they have a pagan festival. And now maybe it is currently the day of that festival in the city. And we have an Issa Drabanan that you don't do business transactions with a guy, a pagan, who observes and worships idols 3 days before Yom Edom. So therefore, Reb Chanina said, according to Rava, that just like in the case of tzur with the two pots on the stove simultaneously, one of the goy, we're not afraid that the goy will turn on the fire underneath the pot of Yisrael. Here too, we're not afraid that a Jew would be lax about it, and if you permit him to do business in the marketplace outside Gaza, he might come to say, you know what, I don't even want to think about or investigate the possibility that they're celebrating their Yom Edom now, and these are the 3 day period of an. No, a Jew would not violate an Issa D'Rabbanan. So just like in the case of Bishul Akum, which is an Issa D'Rabbanan, we're not afraid that the Jew will be careless about it. He's going to be very careful to avoid violating an Issa D'Rabbanan, and he's going to certainly not allow the Akum to turn on the fire under his pot. So too, a Jew is not chashud on an Issa D'Rabbanan of doing transactions with a guy who's an idol worshiper within the 3 day period of Yom Edom. That's the pshat of Rava. So again, basically, according to Rava, what's being taught here by Rabbi Chanina through his analogy is that Chazal are not choshesh for the possibility that the Jew will violate an Isur D'Rabbanan. However, Rava Bar Ulo, which is number 3 to close the entire circle here, Omar, he has a different shot in what Rav Chanina meant from the story in Tzur of Lo Choshu Lehem Chachamim, and the answer is Mishum Tzinora. Now, the word Tzinora literally translates as a pipe. Now, what is the possibility of this Tzinora? What is it all about? So first of all, let's point out that Rabba Bar Ula rejects both Abai and Rava. In other words, he feels that in the case of Tzur, we can't prove anything about whether a Jew would chas v'shalom disregard an Isur D'Rabbanan, because there's no grounds to suspect any violation of an Isur D'Rabbanan with regard to cooking on the same pot, on the same stove. However, according to Rabba Bar Ula, in the case that we're dealing with here in our Mishnah, where the city of Aza, where they worship Avoda Zara, is really close by, then you know what? Maybe the Jew who is doing business in the marketplace of Aza, he has some sort of special relationship with the members of the city of Aza, and he meets them, very often to do business with them. And therefore, to the Jew who frequents this market on a regular basis, he might be so used to doing business there that maybe we should be afraid that he will violate this Isur of business transactions before their Yom Edom. And this is all based on a possibility of being choshesh in the case of two pots on the same stove of tzinora. Now, what does tzinora mean? Again, literally it means a kind of a pipe. But the word tzinora in the Talmud means any sort of movement of liquid from one place to some place that's right near it. Like, for example, the Gemara in Shabbos talks about a tzinor underneath Chami Taveria that brings the hot water from the hot springs, into your bath and so forth and so on. So here too, the concern is that maybe there was a certain transmission of the liquid in which the liquid from the pot of the Ovid Kochavim, which is obviously treif, somehow splashed onto the pot of the Jew. And even though it's unlikely that such a thing would happen, and even if it did, maybe the drop of treifa liquid that came from the pot of the Jew is batel when it hits the pot of the Israel. Again, you have to know a lot about shteik der zu al yad zu, as far as splashings from one to the other. That's Steve, you were talking about contemporary issues. That's very, very contemporary. And there are many people who don't want to put a milchika pot and a fleshika pot that both are cooking at the same time because there are always inevitably splashings. But in any event, what happens is that we're not afraid of splashings. Lo chashu lehem chacham. And that's what Reb Chanina wanted to point out from the case in Tzur, that we're going to allow the two pots to be simultaneously on the same stove, and we're not afraid of splashings. And therefore, if you are engaged in commerce in the market near Aza, during that 3-day period before the festival, so you might think that, you know what, even though it's not the worst Avera in the world, it's relatively a light violation. It's only Xera D'Rabbanan, but nevertheless, maybe, the purchaser has a certain relationship, as we said before, with the Jew who's selling or the Jew who's buying. And therefore, as such, we might think that, it should cross our minds that maybe he'll violate this light Isur D'Rabbanan out of, his desire to do business and his ongoing relationship with the buyers and sellers from Aza in the marketplace contiguous to Aza. And therefore, we want to see, says Rav Chanina, a parallel case where there's an Isur D'Rabbanan the Kal, because as we said, the splashings are probably batel anyway, and yet lo chashu chacham. Okay, now we go on in the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, Ma'u leilech l'sham. Let's say you have to get to a certain destination by going through a city where they're holding a pagan festival. Tanur Rabbanan. Ir sheyesh ba'avodas kol chavim. If this city is a city in which there is Yom Edom, says Rashi, it's a day in which the pagans are celebrating a festival, you're not allowed to enter into the city. Also, not only that, the Brisa teaches that lo mitocha liracheres in Divrei Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says you're not even allowed to enter into the city where they're celebrating the festival of idolatry, even if you're only using the city as a shortcut to get to your destination that's on the other side, outside of the outskirts and the boundaries of the city. Chachamim omrim, no. Kol zman shaderech miyuchedes lioso makom, also, but ein haderech miyuchedes also makom, mutter. If the road that you want to take leads only to that city, so that at the end of the day, when you take that road, even though you may find your location before you get to the city, but that road is the road that people take to the city. And therefore, anybody who sees you going down that road has reason to suspect that you're going into the city where idol worship festivities are going on. But if the road has many different directions, it leads to here, leads to there, not only and not specifically to that city where they're worshiping their deity, then it's mutter. In other words, Rabbi Meir has an absolute straight across the board Isur. He doesn't have any exceptions. The Rabbanan are willing to be more flexible and allow you to go to that derech to get to your place if that derech is not specifically and exclusively used to get to that city. Okay. Now, this whole business about not going into a city where they are observing and celebrating their festival, their pagan festival, is all based on suspicion that someone who sees them going there, they don't know that he's going through the city to another place, but they think he's going to the city and he's going to enjoy the benefit of those festivities. So the Gemara now is going to give us a whole slew of scenarios in which, others might, if you do X, others might suspect you of involving yourself in idolatry. Yashav lo kotes, the first case, bifnei ovid kochavim. What happens if he's got some sort of a thorn that got caught in his foot, and now he has to bend down, bow down in order to get the thorn out of his foot, and it's in front of an idol? Lo yishche v'yitlena. He's not allowed to bend down and take out he's got to relocate himself far away, not in front of an idol. This might sound a little strange to us, that, he's punked exactly when he wants to take out the thorn from his foot. He's standing in front of an idol. But my wife and I were in Thailand, and I can tell you that, there are idols all over the place. Okay, I'm not getting into the issue of Buddhism and what the status of Buddhism is. Okay, fine. V'im eno nira, what does this mean? If it doesn't appear like he's bowing down in front of the idol when he takes out the thorn, then Muti's allowed to do so. So we'll have to wait till the Gemara to see what that means. Second case, this pazulo mosav ifnei ovus kachov. He's got a pocketbook full of coins, and the pocketbook tipped over, and the coins are lying there right in front of an idol. Lo yishchav yitleni. He's not allowed to bend down and take his coins because it looks like what? Once again, those words are going to repeat themselves like a refrain, then it's allowed. Another case, number 3. They have a spring that flows and he wants to drink the water of the spring, but it's right in front of an idol. He shouldn't bow down in order to drink from that spring that's flowing in front of the idol. Case number 4. What they used to do is when they had places where you drank water, they used to have a sculpture, and the water would come out of the mouth of the sculpture. If you've ever been to Italy, you've seen this all over the place. And lo yiriach piv al piam v'yishte. Now, if what's happening is that the human face, which is the sculpture from which the water is coming out of the mouth, might be confused with an idol. It might be a deity. And therefore, if he puts his mouth, to the mouth of this human sculpture, then it might look like he's kissing an idol. Kayotzibo, another similar case. Now this Kayotzibo is already a whole different sugya, and that has to do with sakana. Lo yaniach pival silon v'yishte mibnei sakana. Right? They used to draw water through pipes. Don't put your mouth on the pipe itself and just drink the water. You don't even see what's in the water. Mibnei sakana. And the Gemara is going to later on say what the sakana is of water. And once again, if you've ever been to Italy, they'll tell you whether or not you're allowed to drink it or you can't drink it. Not all water can be drunk. My eno nir, what does it mean that, he's bending down to take the thorn out of his foot, or when he's bending down in order to collect the coins that fell in front of the idol, or when he's, he's drinking from this mayon, and in all these cases it says im eino nir mutter. What's im eino nir mutter? If it means that there's nobody around, so nobody's going to suspect him because no one's there to see it. Homer Rabbi Yehuda Marav, a very famous statement of Rabbi Yehuda Marav, Zasugya in Masech Bebeitza, Kol mokom shasu chavnei marasayin afilu b'chad shechad darim hu da'asur. In other words, when we talk about Maris Ayin is only a gauge to define the similarity or the likeliness of what you're doing to an Avera. But once we define Maris Ayin, meaning that if somebody were to be there, he would suspect you because that's how similar it is to the violation, then that action becomes prohibited straight across the board. We don't have to look over our shoulder and say, well, somebody's looking, so therefore it's awesome. No, it's irrelevant. Even no one's around. You're in the middle of a desert. You still have to enjoin yourself from doing that action because that action itself has a smattering of a violation. So therefore, what could this brisa be meaning when it repeats itself over and over and over again? Then im eno nira mutter. Eno nira means others don't see it. Ella, but rather, Emo, let's reinterpret him. Eno mutter. If it doesn't look like he's bowing down, for example, let's say he turns his back towards the idol. So obviously, right? So let's say there's a little distance between where he's standing and where the idol is, and he turns his back around, and therefore he's not facing the idol, he's facing the thorn on his foot or the money in front of him. Utricha. Now the Gemara wants to, why did the Bryce have to give the same psak over and over and over again, three different scenarios? The Tana quotes if we only had the case of the thorn in his leg, mishum di'efshel mezel kamil mishkali. Who says that you have to take out your thorn right there in front of the idol? Go ahead, pick yourself up, move a couple of feet away, dalat amas, and then take it out. Aval moslo efsha, but the only way he can collect his monies, his coins, is right there on the spot. So then maybe, Amalo, maybe we could be matu, we could be more maker. But in the other way around, we could say it again, E tanamos, dimamona, avakotz did Zara, Amalo. Maybe we'd be more machmir a moment and say, let him lose his coins, forfeit his coins, because we don't want chashom anything to be similar to avodas kocham. But in the case of a coat, he's in pain. And therefore, for the sake of alleviating his pain, maybe we could be more makel. Viton anitarti, if we had these two cases of the thorn and the coins, mishum deleka sakana. There's no element of sakana if we tell him, buddy, don't remove the thorn here in front of the idol. Don't pick up your most in front of the idol. But when it comes to drinking from water, and he's going to have to bend down his body in order to drink from the water that's coming through these pipes and it's in front of an idol, then Dilo Shasi Mais, there's an outside chance that if he doesn't drink immediately, he might die. And therefore it comes under the halacha of Achai ben v'lo shiriyom and pikuach nefesh tochas kol tarkula, aim lo. I might think, therefore, that he's not prohibited and enjoined from bending down in order to drink that water because that water represents his life. Tzricha, and therefore I need all three cases. And obviously, in the last case that we studied about drinking the water, we're talking about a case where it's not pikuach nefesh, but it could be that one situation would lead to another situation that'll lead to pikuach nefesh, and therefore we might think it's mutter. But since we're dealing with avodas kol chavim, which is one of the gimel averes chamuras, a cardinal sin, we're not going to be making.